Welcome to Turning Pages, a series of in-depth conversations with authors about their works.
All right. Well, Wildfire, The Rise of a Hero is the first in the Ashes Over Avalon trilogy, written by Jordan S. Keller, who joins me on the program. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Michael.
Thanks for joining me. Now, I want to talk, first about superheroes and your relationship to superheroes. Were you a comic book fan? Were you someone who watched the movies? Like, where did you kind of start with superheroes?
Yeah, so growing up, I really liked the Marvel movies like Iron Man and Thor, but it wasn't until college that I got heavily into it. I started watching Teen Titans and Young Justice and really fell in love with the Robin mantle, and that got me interested in more. So I started reading all the comic books I could get my hands on. So Nightwing, Teen Titans, Green Arrow, and I just really loved the heroes that weren't necessarily super, but still could hold their own in these types of environments.
So the Robin, obviously, sidekick. Batman's sidekick, and Abigail starts as a sidekick, and so I'm curious, is that like finding the main story for a supporting character? Was that kind of what appealed to you?
Yeah, especially just seeing their growth from starting as like almost this no-name person and then seeing them achieve all this greatness. And I just really, really love seeing that growth of a character.
Does that also put it in a position where like they doubt themselves because they're not central, like there's someone above them?
A little. I took it more as them having the drive to get above and beyond where their station was. And I mean, we all have self-doubt, and being a young author, I experienced that, and it was easy to put that into my characters and have them become like rise above it, essentially.
Right. Now, in the acknowledgments, you mentioned that Abigail wouldn't have come about had it not been for D&D games with your husband. And I don't know if there's like a natural like one-to-one of like D&D and a superhero, but how did Abigail come out of D&D?
Yeah, so the game in question was a 2-year game we had all played in college, and after the game ended, I wasn't ready to give up Abigail as like a character, and her name was Alpha in the game. And so once the game ended and I moved away from all my college friends, I would write her in all these different scenarios. So she was in the Wild West, she was aboard a space station, she was a medieval princess slaying dragons. And I started writing her in a comic book setting, and that really stuck with her. And I really felt her grow and become her own kind of hero in this world. And by the end of one summer, I had over 30,000 words of this setting with her being a superhero. And I thought I owed it to myself and her as a character to see what I could do with it. So I really focused on writing an outline and structuring a story and making it a full novel instead of a bunch of little stories strung together.
What was it about her as a character that you translated her amongst like genres and settings? Like how do you see her as being the same across all of these things versus like a different person?
Yeah, so the main part of Abigail Alpha is her desire to be who she thinks that she is, and just this power to not let anyone stand in her way and achieve these goals she set for herself. And that was always attractive to me. And I'd always think like, what would Abigail do in this situation? And she's kind of the hero I wish I could be in my day-to-day. Like she's never afraid to say what she needs to say and never afraid to do what she needs to do.
Well, so I don't want to like challenge you as the author of your own character, but like she does have fear.
Yeah, I think all characters need fears, they need obstacles. They can't just be these perfect beings or else they're no fun to write. So off to the side when I was writing and even playing the game, I'd have all these things that Abigail Alpha, that she did fear, that she wasn't good at, just to make sure I would remember and make sure those came forward into the story anytime that they could.
So when you're creating the character in D&D, obviously like there's characteristics, there's skills, there's kind of different things to kind of give you like a legend. Or like a little map for your character. Do you feel that Abigail are the same as Alpha in that respect? Like, does it hold true to what your original idea was?
I'd say about 50% holds true to the initial game, to the finished product. In the game, the character was a barbarian, so not as smart as Abigail is in the books, and not as much logical thinking that she currently has now versus when she first started in that game.
Sure enough. Now, obviously, you create this character and then you start envisioning her in different worlds and different settings. The world that you come up with, I'm curious about kind of what goes into world building, because you've got this city and it's kind of essentially divided into two like territories for different superhero groups to And I mean, it made me think a little bit about like Vought in this kind of corporatization of superheroes. But like, was that something that you were aware of or thinking about, or like, how did you build San Arbor and kind of like the population of superheroes?
Yeah, so I'm so glad you brought up The Boys. I think it's a fantastic show and a fantastic comic book. But even growing up with just the Marvel movies, I always knew if superheroes existed in our world, we would somehow make them corporation owned. They would all be about their media personas, all about what they could sell merchandise wise, how we could, like as a society, make money off of them. And that was always fascinating to me. And I knew I wanted those elements in my own writing. And then when I was about halfway through the novel when I started watching The Boys, and it was great to kind of see how they handled certain situations and how I could handle situations in my own world. And San Arbor as a whole, as a city, it was super easy. I just kind of copied and pasted my hometown of Cincinnati, Ohio, and that was the backdrop that I was writing to, and just changed the names and the street names and um,
But you pictured Cincinnati as it exists, and so when Abigail moves about, it's in a space but it's just kind of dressed up a different way.
exactly. And that helped the world building a lot because I wasn't struggling so much. I'm like, well, where does this street end up? And where could I put this deli? And it was all my backyard.
Right. Now, obviously, in The Boys, Vought is kind of like the premier thing, and then there's kind of like the like lower levels, or like it's the bigs, and then there's like the minor leagues. This has like kind of like it's almost like a Pepsi versus Coke kind of dichotomy. How did you conceive of that dynamic?
I love the Pepsi versus Coke. That's very cool. I knew there would be two different hero agencies in Santa Arbor, and I wanted one to be a bit more like it's all about the numbers. It's all about how many saves we can get, how much money we can bring in, versus the other one, which is quote unquote the better one, because it's no, 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 we're here to save people. We're here to work well with others. That bottom line dollar is the last thing we're thinking about. And just sort of the dichotomy between the two viewpoints of these corporate owned superheroes, and how one, the corporation's more in charge versus the other one where the heroes are more in charge.
And I guess, does it allow you to kind of explore not just like corporate like chicanery within like its own employees, but like kind of against other corporations? Like, is that something that you were kind of keen to explore?
A little, not going in was that sort of my mindset, but as I was going through with the editing of the second and third drafts, I really got to play around with those differences and how some corporations are run and versus how, in my mind, I think they should be ran. So those were funner things to explore once I got the bulk of the world created and all the writing essentially finished.
So then those, draft process, what are you looking for? What are you kind of pulling out? What are you thinking I need to develop more? How do you go about kind of identifying those things?
Yeah, so usually I've got like a 4 draft process. The first draft, I call it my trash draft, and it's just me word vomiting the story on the page. There's no real structure. There's just sort of a beginning, middle, and end. And then the second draft, I beef everything up. I know where I need to explore more opportunities for character growth and better setting development and things like that. So that the second draft is usually when all the hard work gets taken care of. And then the third draft is going in through line edits, making sure I'm using all the right word choices I want to use, making sure the characters' dialogues are staying throughout the whole story. And then after that, that's when I'll ask people to read it and give me feedback on. And then that final draft is incorporating their feedback, clearing up any issues that people found confusing, changing any people have the coolest ideas that I don't think of at first, and being able to brainstorm with them, and then changing those scenes to be more dramatic or have a more emotional punch at the end.
Is that space between the third and fourth draft kind of the hardest thing to like take it to someone else and see what they think about it?
100%. I read somewhere another author had said writing is very selfish, and then sharing that's very selfless. And being able to remove yourself from your world and like knowing the feedback that you're getting is to make it better, but also having to accept that it wasn't as good as you thought it was when you first sent it out. And I did struggle with that a lot in the beginning. And the best thing I learned was before you're ready to give it out, take a month away from it. Like, don't even think about it. Don't look at it. That way you're not as attached to the current draft and you're able to look at it with fresh eyes and able to accept opinions and everything.
So that any feedback you get just doesn't automatically feel like someone scratching at like a wound.
100%.
So giving it out to other readers, like, or to readers, I guess obviously you're maybe your first reader, but at that point, like, how open are you to like shifts? Like, are you like, we'll see kind of what people come up with, or is it, this is kind of the plot mechanics are what I want to happen in this?
Yeah, so I knew like the major plot points were going to be the same. The main change between that third and fourth draft was the ending. Originally, Abigail had more of a sidelines role, and then someone talked to me about making her had that big fight at the end, essentially. And so that made the book 10 times better. But when I look for readers, I want to look for readers who read in the genre, who know about all the superhero tropes that I'm trying to convey, and then readers who are more casual into the world and just looking for a good story. And then, because someone who doesn't read science fiction and superheroes, they might not enjoy it as much as other people, but they're going to have insights to like character descriptions and plot movings that might be overlooked with other readers. So it's good to make sure you have a wide variety of your early readers, and then knowing that some feedback is going to be personal preference to the reader and not necessarily something that everyone's going to notice or care about.
How do you gauge what's personal preference then?
I'm in a writing group, and our rule of thumb is if one or two people say something, it's personal preference. If three or more people all say the same thing, then you should consider looking into it.
Right. So then did you have instances of three or more people having the same perspective on the book?
Yeah, that ending scene mainly was the big thing, just upping it up, getting it more dramatic, more emotional, making Abigail more of the star at the end. And then there is a lot of back and forth. There's a makeout scene halfway through the book, and originally it went pretty far and went pretty long, and that was a huge discussion of how much do I show, how far do I let my readers in, and so there was a lot of back and forth on that, and finally, like, more people were like, no, let it go further, let's see everything, and I made that call, like, nope, we're going to cut it off right here, and so I mean that's that. You can't always agree with your readers because you want the story to be how you want to tell it. But those are the two main instances that come to mind.
Sure enough. I'm glad you mentioned the makeout scene, because this is a superhero book, but there is like a romance thread that weaves through it throughout. And was that always going to be there, or was that something that like this character you wanted for this character? Like, how did you come up with that?
Yeah, so I'm a hopeless romantic at heart, and so I knew there was going to be some romance involved, but I didn't expect it to take such center stage as it did. I'm very happy that it did. I thought it brought a great element to the book, and it extends to the rest of the series as well. But it was one of those instances where the characters kind of made it so that this was going to keep coming back and back, and I just kind of ran with it, and I'm really glad that I did.
So then, I mean, without giving too much away about kind of like, but essentially she's falling for the villain in this book. I don't think that's a secret. Deciding that, like, is this like the bad boy trope, or like what were you trying to kind of play into by, making this the person she was interested in?
Yeah, so definitely leaning into that bad boy trope as a marketing mindset. It does sell very well, and I was kind of leaning towards that. But I also love a good redemption arc, and I feel like Cinder does get that. And so I wanted that kind of character in my novel, this misunderstood, like he's filling this role he thinks he needs to fill, and then us discovering why he feels that way, what he really wants to do, and how he can take those steps to become the person he's always wanted to be.
So that dynamic, like the push-pull that she has with him, it's, that she feels attracted to him. She doesn't necessarily think he's all bad. Like initially, before she really knows him, she obviously considers him a villain. But there's a lot within every person in this book, right? Like not like the heroic corporations kind of behave poorly, that like nothing's black and white. And it seems like maybe that's kind of part of Abigail's learning process as a hero, is like realizing that.
Yeah, Yeah, 100, like just like you said, the black and white. I don't think any decision we make as people has a definite good side, bad side. I think there's so many decisions and so many elements that make us choose the way we choose. And exploring that was really cool. And especially because if you are a hero with all this power, everything you do is going to feel like the right thing. But if you can take a step back and look at it objectively, maybe it's not the right thing. Maybe it could have been handled better. And her realizing that in the book was really cool to write and really cool to explore because it kind of shifts her entire thinking mentality of what a hero is and what her job is in the society.
Speaking of her thinking, there's a lot of like interiority, like Abigail's thoughts are on the page, and some of it's doubt and like negative self talk, right? Like one of the things she kind of like, I picked up on it that she says "nice job, hero" to herself, but like in a demeaning way, like throughout the book, or at least for a good portion of the book before she kind of finally like finds her medal. And I was curious, was that something like you were trying to broach just like in terms of like mental health and women's view of themselves and imposter syndrome? Like what were you getting at with that?
I don't think intentionally I was going with an imposter syndrome with all that self-doubt, but it did come across that way throughout the novel. And I knew Abigail was going to struggle with finding herself in this world that is dominated by dudes, which is dominated by all these heroes, and she's still a sidekick, and all these hurdles she feels like she has to jump to prove to herself and to her city that she's able to be there and stand among them. So it just sort of came out naturally. So I'm glad that it did though.
Right. Now you'd mentioned, like a person like Robin being kind of an entry point for you, that like heroes without powers, but this is a world with powers.
Mhm.
Did you like contemplate, like vigilante kind of more like Batman and Robin style, like just tech and like smarts and creating a world like that? Or like what was the decision making went into like, yes, this is a world with powers, and what will those powers be?
Yeah, so it was always going to be a world with powers, and going back to that Dungeons and Dragons game, Alpha was able to like set her sword on fire, and so that's always stuck with Abigail having these fire powers. And as much as I love heroes that do tech and are more um, off the grid superpowers, I didn't think I could write it to be as engaging as having all these flashy powers. So it was just sort of like a safe call to use all these powers to be more exciting to write versus trying to, because myself, I wouldn't have understood all the gadgets and gizmos. And so I just knew that would be more difficult to write as an early author.
So the veracity of a tech or someone using these things rather than powers, you can just kind of like wash away. Like people are willing to kind of suspend disbelief a little bit.
Absolutely. In an early draft of Wildfire, I had her messing with a gadget, and I remember the line was like, uh, I don't understand how this works. I just know that it does. I'm like, I can't use it as a crutch to this whole book. Let's just kind of remove those elements and keep it something I know how to convey.
So that's something that went into maybe that second draft, like isolating this is a problem. Like I can't unwrite this or have to keep writing this and yada yadaing it.
Yeah, and to make it feel believable too.
Right. So even obviously she joins this heroic company that's like based on kind of the Knights of the Round Table, and the Merlin character kind of is using like science, like faux science and magic. Was that something that you kind of were weaving in because of this?
No, as a science lover at heart, I really wanted this character who 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 loves the science part of all the, because her power she can combine and pull apart atoms and compounds, and that's just super cool to me. But I knew that other like in Merlin's mind, if she portrayed herself as a science character, it wouldn't have went over well. But if she could flavor it with magic, then it would it would sell better as the corporate owned medias, and it fit more of that King Arthur aesthetic that she had been hired on for.
Well, speaking of selling better, like marketing is something that gets touched on a lot in this book, right? That like the superhero corporations kind of market themselves, and there's like the image and things like that. How fully did you conceive of kind of that part of the world when you were writing? Like, was that in that first draft, or was that something that you've worked out in that second draft when you did the work of kind of like honing things?
Yeah, more of the grunt work went into that second draft, but there were elements in it in the first draft. My day job, I do some marketing, and so it was easy to pull from that. And then learning where some of those elements fell short in the second draft, I was able to expand and add a bit more humor into it and add a bit more logistics on what would create like influxes and kind of default their media rankings and their advertisements and put more thought into that versus putting more thought into the plot in that first draft.
Right. Now, obviously, we mentioned off the top, this is part of the Ashes Over Avalon trilogy. Like, did you conceive of this? Like you said, you'd written like 30,000 words by the time you realized, oh, like this isn't just like some loose stories that I've written about this character. I've got a book here. But at what point did you think I have, a trilogy, or like, that this story doesn't just live in one book?
So book one was written as a standalone, and then after I finished writing it and was trying to market it to get published, the characters were just like, oh, what would this happen? What if this happened? And I was drafting a second book just for myself. And when my agent, my now agent, when she was looking at the manuscripts and stuff, she had asked me what I thought about if there could be a book two and a book three to it. And I'm like, oh yeah, sure, I've got ideas. And saying that, thinking nothing would come of it, landed a 3-book deal with our publisher. So thankfully I had that very bad draft of book two ready to go to show them. And they liked where it was going. And then we brainstormed book three together. So initially it was just that one standalone book and then some extra stuff for me. And then my agent publisher really liked the extra stuff. And so we ran with the 3-book series.
So wasn't like George Lucas where he's like, episode 4 and I've got 5 and 6 already mapped out and stuff. No. So revisiting a character then, I mean, without getting into the other books, like going back to her, had you grown with your kind of notion of Abigail enough that like it was easier to write the next book?
100%. Yeah. Especially because I felt like book one was establishing who she was and getting her to this role of what she's always wanted to be, which is that hero. And the next books we could focus on what it means to be a hero, what it meant to Abigail and what she thinks being a hero is like, and really more exploring the insides of her mind and her dreams and then how she uses those to better her society. So it was really cool to like really establish who she was in book one and really explore who she could become in book two and book three.
So I asked you about, like a world with powers. One thing I didn't ask specifically though is like Abigail's fire powers. Like, did you wrestle with like what powers she would have or like try out different powers?
I wrestled with them a bunch because I didn't want any hero to be too powerful because, again, like I mentioned, that's no fun to write an all-powerful person. So in my mind, like she can do all these super cool, flashy things, but then, well, that makes her too strong. Or how would she even fight against a villain if she could just mow over them so easily? Where would any of the conflict come from? So just forcing myself to scale back these powers and making sure I knew what could defeat them, what hindered them. So like if she runs out of breath, she can't summon the fire. So incorporating that a lot, like, so she's really focusing on her endurance. And so that way she doesn't lose her breath or if she gets knocked down and the breath gets knocked out of her lungs. So just making sure I knew what defeated all these powers so that it made for a more interesting story and for more interesting villains.
Where her limitations lie so that
Yeah.
you can push up against them.
Yeah.
Speaking of her limitations, obviously when she loses her job at one hero company, she, kind of left bereft and figuring out what to do. But she has, as she knows, a gap in her resume and like how to explain that. And like, she's built up all these skills that are not transferable. And I was curious about kind of like creating a world where like, if she's not doing this, what is she?
Mm-hmm. That I took that straight from a page in my own book. After I graduated college, the job I got had nothing to do with my degree, and I felt like I felt like a loser. Like I've done all this work for nothing, and thankfully I no longer feel that way. And what I learned in school I can apply elsewhere. But just being able to kind of share that feeling with my own character was very healing in that process of being like, doesn't matter what we knew, we can still be good elsewhere. So that's where that kind of came from.
Okay, so that takes me back to the D&D thing. Because usually, like, when you create a character, it's somewhat of an avatar for you. right? In D&D. So was this in some way like authorial projection of like, this is what I'm wrestling with, this is what I want to do, or this is what I'm trying to process, or did that just kind of come about accidentally?
I think it came out accidentally, or at least subconsciously. So playing in the D&D game wasn't like as emotionally connected as Abigail became in the books. But like the D&D version of her was everything I wish I could be: strong and powerful and brash, and then being able to explore those reasons later on in the book was really cool.
Well, Abigail's definitely less brash.
Yes, she is.
Right. I would say like strong, powerful, but like also full of doubts about that power. So was that kind of like when you'd written the character for D&D, you thought, well, maybe that doesn't necessarily translate as well to the type of story I want to tell here?
Yeah, it was hard to write her as a barbarian without any like, I don't want to say without any logic, but like in the game, she was like punch first, ask questions later, and that doesn't make a good hero. So I had to sort of rethink that moving forward into the book, that she would have to sort of think through things before she acts. Not always, though. She is a little bit reckless. So just taking the quote unquote good parts of her game character to bring forward into the book.
Yeah, punching might work like in a panel of a comic book, as an exciting thing. But I think for a narrative story, it's maybe harder to convey kinetic action all the time.
Yeah, you can't just have a pow in the middle of the page and move on. You gotta have some emotion behind it.
So then how did you work out, building up or writing the action pieces that happen in the book?
Yeah, so I take Tai Chi and Kung Fu, so I had the background of experience of knowing how to throw that punch, what it feels like to be hit. And so just pulling through those personal experiences into the book. And that's one of the reasons I had early readers for, is to make sure the combat made sense, that people could visualize what was happening without it being confusing. And then in the book, Abigail gets a sword that she has to train with, and her day one sword training was the exact same as my day one broadsword training in Tai Chi. So it was just really easy to incorporate those elements and those feelings and all those moves and stuff that I had been learning myself.
Well, there you go. Jordan Keller is not Abigail Turner, but she's the creator of Abigail Turner. Wildfire, The Rise of a Hero, out now. Book 1 of the Ashes Over Avalon trilogy. Jordan, thanks very much for taking some time to join me on the program.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me, Michael.